The chamber of the House was filled with a palpable wave of tension that stretched across the room, creating an almost electric atmosphere. As Representative Jasmine Crockett made her way decisively toward the podium, every eye in the room followed her movement with keen interest and anticipation. The cameras operated by C-SPAN, the official broadcaster, sharpened their focus, capturing every detail of the young, ambitious Democrat from Texas. Her look was striking, her hair styled in braids pulled back neatly, complementing her vivid purple suit, which stood out boldly against the more subdued navy blue and gray tones that dominated the chamber. It was a deliberate choice, a visual statement that she was not afraid to stand out and be heard. Meanwhile, across the chamber, Speaker Mike Johnson sat rigidly in his seat, appearing utterly composed, scrolling through his phone with an expression of mild detachment that suggested he was untroubled by the 5 minutes allocated to Crockett's speech. To him, this was an everyday occurrence, another standard moment for political posturing, another opportunity for opposition members to make a spectacle. When Crockett finally spoke, her voice was calm yet unwavering, steady enough to command attention from even the most distracted onlookers. As her words filled the chamber, the ambient noise gradually diminished, yielding space for her message to take hold. She began by asserting, not as a partisan Democrat, but as an ordinary citizen deeply concerned about the integrity of the government. Her tone conveyed seriousness and conviction. Today, I rise not merely as a Democrat addressing a Republican, but as an American stepping forward to confront a grave violation of public trust. Her words cut through the usual din, forcing those present to pay closer attention. Seated at his desk, Johnson's facial expression remained largely unchanged, a faint, polite mask of disinterest that had become familiar over the years. His eyes flicked upward briefly, acknowledging her with a subdued nod, which signaled recognition but little engagement. To him, this was just another routine exercise, a member of the opposition utilizing her allocated time aboard a well-rehearsed political stage. Meanwhile, Crockett pressed on, her voice increasing in strength and clarity. She continued, "Last week, you stood at this very same podium and assured the American people that the new border legislation was passed with, I quote, full transparency and unprecedented bipartisan input." Her tone grew sharper as she held up a folder, embossed with the official seal of the House. "I have here documents," she announced, "that not only contradict that claim, but also expose a disturbing pattern of deliberate misinformation being presented to this chamber and the American public." The room's background hum intensified, with murmurs spreading among the members as they turned their heads towards her. Crockett's hand steadied as she lifted the folder, emphasizing her point. "These documents reveal that the final version of the bill was altered in secret after it had already been approved in committee. Critical enforcement provisions were removed, and new loopholes were inserted, without informing the minority members, who had negotiated in good faith. This is a clear breach of both transparency and trust." Her assertiveness brought the chamber's noise to a temporary halt. Johnson, now fully attentive, set his phone down on the desk and straightened his posture as the Republican whips hurried through the aisles, whispering urgently to colleagues. An undercurrent of tension rippled through the chamber as the gravity of her revelations began to sink in. Yet, as alarming as the deception appeared, Crockett wasn't finished. She pressed forward, her voice rising slightly amid the rising murmurs. "More troubling than the fact of deception itself is what these documents reveal about the true authorship of these changes. Mr. Speaker, I must ask, why does verbatim language from private industry lobbyists appear in sections of this bill, sections that you personally certified as drafted by your own staff?" Her question hung in the air, challenging the assumptions of authority and oversight. A hush fell over the chamber, broken only by the stunned silence of many members. Johnson's face paled visibly. His usual composure faltered as he gestured hurriedly toward the parliamentarian, seeking guidance and perhaps some way to stem the crisis. Cameras shifted repeatedly between Crockett's controlled, resolute demeanor and Johnson's sudden discomfort, capturing every moment of the unfolding spectacle. Before he could respond, a voice from the opposition shouted out a point of order in an attempt to derail her line of questioning. "Mr. Speaker," called out the Republican Majority Leader, attempting to cut her off. However, Crockett remained unshaken, her voice steady and unwavering. "I still have approximately 4 minutes and 20 seconds left," she stated calmly, fully aware of the moment's gravity. "And I am determined to use every second to expose the truth." Her words, spoken with conviction, sent shockwaves through Congress and threatened to upend the delicate balance of power that had long governed Washington's political landscape. Before delving further into what transpired in those critical moments, the narration paused, gently shifting the focus for a moment with an appeal aimed at the audience. It encouraged viewers not to forget about the importance of staying informed and staying engaged. Remember to stay tuned and reflect on these behind-the-scenes insights that reveal how power truly operates in Washington. The narrator summarized tersely that Jasmine Crockett had not come to Capitol Hill simply to conform to the old, familiar rules of politics. Rather, she had arrived to challenge, disrupt, and reshape them in pursuit of transparency and justice. Before securing her seat in Texas in the year 2022, she had established herself as a formidable civil rights attorney. Her reputation was built on a foundation of relentless preparation and an unwavering willingness to confront powerful interests head-on. Unlike many newcomers, who typically spend their initial congressional terms quietly navigating the complexities of the legislative process and trying to understand the unwritten rules, Crockett distinguished herself from the very beginning as someone who possessed a deep understanding of her subject matter and was prepared to actively use that knowledge to make an impact. She approached the work of Congress with the same vigor and thoroughness as she did her previous role in the courtroom, a comparison made clear by a former law partner who explained earlier that year to the Texas Tribune that Crockett's method was to meticulously collect evidence, construct an almost unassailable case, and then present it with unflinching confidence, without regard for who might oppose her or how formidable their defenses might be. This resolute approach did not go unnoticed. It earned her recognition and respect among progressive colleagues who valued her tenacity and clarity of purpose. However, it also made her a frequent focus of conservative media outlets, which often characterized her as overly aggressive and confrontational. Her trademark response to such criticism came during an interview with CNN, where she addressed the double standards she perceived. When men approach issues with the same thoroughness and straightforwardness, they are often praised as effective leaders, while when she, and women like her, do the same, they are labeled as aggressive. Her stance was clear and unwavering. She would continue to be assertive for the people who entrusted her with representing their interests and fighting for their rights, regardless of the media's labels or the reactions of her opponents. Across the chamber sat Mike Johnson, who had recently been elevated to the role of Speaker of the House. His rise to the position followed a tumultuous and chaotic process after the ouster of Kevin McCarthy, during which Johnson positioned himself as a calm, conservative figure grounded in faith and committed to unity within a fractured Republican caucus. His modest demeanor and reputation for decorum initially garnered positive impressions from colleagues and from many in the press who saw in him a return to civility and stability in a time of political turbulence. Following his election, popular media figures, such as Fox News host Sean Hannity, praised him as a constitutionalist dedicated to transparent governance and honest debate, thus framing his leadership as a hopeful sign for bipartisan cooperation. However, Just 7 months into his tenure, that initial sense of unity and goodwill began to fade. Some moderate Republicans in Congress privately expressed their frustration, feeling sidelined and ignored within the party's power dynamics. Meanwhile, Democrats openly accused Johnson of breaking the commitments he had made during recent negotiations, allegations that cast doubt on his transparency and sincerity. The immediate flashpoint was a border security bill that Johnson claimed as a significant bipartisan success. After months of deadlock and political standoff, this legislation managed to pass with support from moderates across both parties, an outcome Johnson promoted as proof that Congress could still come together to address urgent national issues. In the past week, Johnson actively promoted the bill on a media tour, emphasizing it as evidence that meaningful cooperation between the parties remained possible, even amid deep divisions. His messaging sought to reassure the public and stakeholders that the legislative body was capable of delivering tangible results through compromise. Yet, beneath this narrative, serious concerns were beginning to surface. Reports and inquiries were raising questions about how this final version of the bill was crafted, specifically, whether the promises made during negotiations had been faithfully honored in the process of finalizing the legislation. The implications of these questions extended far beyond the details of one bill, especially with the upcoming midterm elections looming and control of Congress hanging in the balance. The political atmosphere was tense, and doubts about integrity could potentially reshape the landscape of American politics. For members of the Republican Party, any hint that their newly installed leader, the Speaker, might have engaged in deception or dishonesty threatened not only his authority, but also the broader message of reform and transparency they sought to project. Political scientist Melissa Harris Perry stated on MSNBC that morning, perhaps unwittingly foreshadowing subsequent developments, that the real issue at stake was whether the entire legislative process had become so fundamentally broken that even agreements made across party lines could no longer be trusted. For Mike Johnson himself, the stakes were deeply personal. He had built much of his political identity on a foundation of faith, integrity, and the desire to restore trust in leadership, especially at a time when such trust had been frayed and questioned. Any credible evidence suggesting deliberate deception during the legislative process would not just threaten his current agenda, but would strike at the very core of his political reputation and the principles he professed to uphold. Similarly, Crockett faced a similar set of risks. Her credibility as a steadfast advocate for justice and her reputation as a principled leader could be undermined if questions of honesty and transparency were not addressed convincingly. And those dangers loomed as a significant concern in this tense and uncertain chapter of her career and of the nation's political life. Facing the Speaker across the chamber floor with such serious accusations was a moment fraught with danger and potential consequence. It was a test that could either elevate the young Congresswoman's reputation, establishing her as a tenacious and fearless champion of transparency and accountability, or it could backfire, exposing her as overly aggressive or reckless if her evidence proved flimsy or insufficient. The tense atmosphere in the room was palpable, each faction reacting differently to this high-stakes confrontation. The Republican members, noting the gravity of her challenge, clustered protectively around Representative Johnson, serving as a visible barrier, signaling their support and readiness to defend their leader at all costs. Meanwhile, the Democrats observed her closely, aware that her actions and the evidence she presented could directly influence the political narrative, reflecting on all of them depending on how convincingly she made her case. As she stepped forward, preparing to lay out her evidence, every individual present couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment's historical significance. Here was a relatively new member of Congress directly questioning the Speaker of the House, an experience that could either fade into a minor footnote in legislative history or become a pivotal event that defined how Congress held itself accountable. The scene felt charged with anticipation, as if history itself was holding its breath. Johnson, sensing the imminent challenge, adjusted his tie carefully and leaned slightly toward the House parliamentarian, possibly hoping to find a procedural loophole or technicality that would allow him to stop her from speaking further, to derail her efforts before her case gained too much ground. Yet, before he could act to intervene or silence her, she pressed on with the calm, methodical demeanor for which she was known. She kept her focus sharp and her voice steady as she addressed the chamber. Looking directly at her audience, she declared, "Before we dive deeper into the details, I believe it's important to understand the context which makes these recent alterations truly troubling." Her words carried a sense of purpose as she drew the members' and spectators' attention to the foundation of her argument. She then directed everyone's gaze towards a specific document, which she referred to as Exhibit A. As pages were passed along the aisles, staff members hurriedly distributed copies of the document to interested members. These papers contained the minutes from the final bipartisan negotiations concerning the Border Security Act, an agreement finalized exactly 2 weeks earlier. Her sharp eyes fixed on a particular segment displayed prominently on the big screen at the front of the chamber. She pointed to page 3, highlighting a statement related to the agreement. The passage read, "No substantial changes will be made to the enforcement provisions in sections 4 through 7, as agreed upon by this working group." This was a critical promise, a commitment that every member, regardless of party affiliation, Republican or Democrat, had relied upon when supporting the bill. The room's atmosphere shifted as the cameras from C-SPAN panned across the chamber, catching the hurried scans of the document by skeptical or concerned members of the opposition. Meanwhile, Johnson himself conferred quietly with the chamber's parliamentarian, possibly seeking advice or guidance on how to handle this unexpected challenge. Yet, despite their efforts, Crockett continued to build her argument. She pointed out that, according to the latest version of the bill, the text now contained exactly 17 significant and substantive modifications made to those very sections. Modifications that did not merely involve technical amendments or minor clarifications. Instead, they represented deliberate weakening of enforcement mechanisms and the addition of exemptions and loopholes that had never been discussed or agreed upon in any bipartisan meeting or negotiation. A side-by-side visual comparison suddenly appeared on the large screen behind her, illustrating the stark differences between the original agreed-upon language and the final, amended text. For example, in Section 4, Paragraph 3, the original requirement mandated that compliance verification occur within a 30-day window. The amended version, however, extended this period dramatically to 180 days, and it further included a provision allowing for unlimited 90-day extensions, an obvious attempt to delay or weaken enforcement efforts. This change directly undermined the moderate Democrats' insistence on timely and strict enforcement, a condition they had set to secure their support for the bill. The room buzzed with murmurs, discontent, surprise, and growing frustration. Among those Democrats who had initially voted yes, confident they were supporting a measure that would be effectively enforced. Some of these members now confronted their staff, holding the documents up and jabbing their fingers at specific lines and paragraphs, anger visibly mounting as they realized the scope of these last-minute alterations. It was clear that these were not minor technical edits, but strategic modifications aimed at diluting the bill's original intent. Johnson finally responded, rising to his feet to address the chamber with a measured tone. "Point of order," he announced loudly, turning to the presiding officer. "Mr. Speaker," he continued, "the member from Texas is mischaracterizing routine legislative refinements, and she is suggesting malicious intent where there is none. These are normal procedural adjustments, part of the legislative process, and attributing sinister motives to them is unfounded." Crockett, maintaining her composed and even tone, replied immediately, "I appreciate the Speaker's attempt to clarify, but I think it's crucial that we look at what these documents reveal." She then directed everyone's attention to a new set of documents, which suddenly appeared on the chamber's big screen. This time, they were emails exchanged between the Speaker's chief legislative assistant and representatives of the Border Industry Coalition, a lobbying group representing private detention contractors. Their correspondence suggested behind-the-scenes negotiations and potential conflicts of interest, raising serious questions about the integrity of the process and the true motivations behind these last-minute bill modifications. As the emails appeared on the screen, Johnson's jaw tightened, signaling his recognition of the growing confrontation and the implications of her revelations. This event took place 3 days after a significant bipartisan consensus had been reached on a crucial piece of legislation, and it occurred just 2 days prior to the formal release of the final, official version of the bill's text. During this intense and tense session, an email was circulated, which contained an attachment labeled Proposed Modifications to Enforcement Provisions. When one carefully compared this document with the final version of the bill, it became clear that out of the total of 17 proposed changes related to enforcement, 15 of them remained unchanged in wording, indicating a near-identical match. The reaction in the legislative chamber was immediate and electric. A burst of noise and emotion erupted from the members present. Members of the Democratic Party rose from their seats in shock, standing in a silent but firm protest. Meanwhile, their counterparts from the Republican side gathered into clusters, whispering hurriedly among themselves, perhaps discussing the implications of the revelations. The presiding officer of the chamber, feeling the rising disorder, resorted to pounding notably on the gavel, attempting to restore calm and order among the tumult of voices and gesticulations. In the midst of this chaos, Representative Jim Jordan moved quickly toward the speaking well, signaling an intent to intervene and possibly challenge what was unfolding before everyone's eyes. Yet, Crockett, a fellow representative, held up a hand, signaling her intention to speak. With an unwavering tone, she clarified that she still had her allotted speaking time and intended to make full use of it. Her voice was steady but controlled, underscoring the seriousness of her statement. She pointed out that the evidence now before the chamber was incomplete, hinting at deeper issues beneath the surface of the ongoing debate. As Jordan hesitated, Crockett proceeded to introduce an exhibit, specifically a document designated as Exhibit C, which was a key piece of evidence. She described this exhibit as perhaps the most troubling of all, revealing a private communication exchanged the day before the final version of the bill was made public. The text exchange occurred between none other than Speaker Johnson and the president of the Border Industry Coalition. In this message, the speaker allegedly wrote, "Change is implemented as discussed. Democrats won't notice until after passage. We'll call you after the vote." The words hung heavily in the air, and a palpable shift could be felt across the room. As everyone absorbed the message, a collective sense of disbelief arose. Speaker Johnson's facial expression visibly changed from a composed demeanor to a pallid, ash-colored face, betraying his inner tension. Democrats appeared visibly stunned by the revelation, their faces showing disbelief and concern. Conversely, some Republicans seemed to experience a split. Some indicated a defensive stance, while others appeared to be withdrawing or reevaluating their positions in light of this new evidence. Amid this charged atmosphere, Crockett, addressing the presiding officer directly, posed a pointed question. Did he, the speaker, want to explain to the assembled members, especially those Democrats who had supported the bill in good faith, why he had assured them that there would be no substantive changes, while secretly, behind the scenes, working hand in hand with industry lobbyists to weaken the core enforcement provisions? The question demanded accountability and transparency at a critical moment. Johnson responded, attempting to regain his composure, but his voice was tinged with the beginnings of frustration. He insisted that the allegations were taken out of context and that the communications were simply routine discussions with stakeholders aimed at ensuring smooth and effective implementation of the bill. He claimed that no commitments or promises had been made that would violate the spirit or the original intent of the legislation. However, Crockett countered sharply, presenting documentary evidence that painted a different picture. She displayed side by side the actual bipartisan agreement on the enforcement provisions, the recommendations from industry lobbyists, and the final text of the bill. It was undeniable that the texts matched directly. Words, phrases, and sentences aligned precisely, leaving no room for interpretation. Her firm assertion was that the very mechanisms designed to secure broad Democratic support had, at the request of industry actors, been systematically weakened. These modifications had been made quietly, without informing the members who originally negotiated and supported those provisions, thereby undermining their intentions and trust. The gavel struck again and again as tensions surged on both sides of the chamber, voices rising in a chorus of disagreement and outrage. Crockett looked at her watch and announced that she had just 1 minute remaining to speak. Her voice, however, was unmistakably loud and penetrating, cutting through the rising noise of the chamber. She expressed her urgent desire to use this remaining moment not just to defend her position, but to emphasize why all these events mattered so profoundly. Once again, the chamber fell into a moment of quiet, as her words demanded reflection. She emphasized that this was not merely an ordinary policy dispute, but rather a fundamental question about the functioning and integrity of their legislative body. Her tone was measured, deliberate, but firm. If members could no longer trust that the agreements they reached in good faith would be honored without deception or covert negotiations, then the very foundation of their work as lawmakers was in jeopardy. If private interests and lobbyists could secretly manipulate legislation after it had been agreed upon across party lines, then the essence of representative democracy was being eroded. Such actions would demonstrate that they had ceased to be genuine representatives of the people's will and interests. Turning to address the entire chamber, Crockett declared her initial belief upon entering politics, that despite inevitable disagreements, the sanctity and integrity of their legislative process should remain inviolable. Today, however, she openly questioned whether this trust still endured. She called upon members from both parties to stand up and demonstrate that their shared commitment to honest and transparent governance was still alive. Her words conveyed a plea for each member to reflect on their own principles and responsibilities. Her 5-minute speech reached its conclusion with that last, decisive word, leaving the chamber in a state of somber silence. The presiding officer, visibly shaken by the intensity of the exchange and the seriousness of the revelations, formally announced that the time allocated to Crockett had expired. His voice carried the weight of the moment, acknowledging that a critical chapter in the chamber's proceedings had just closed. Everyone present in the chamber instinctively understood that something far more significant than mere the passage of time had just occurred. The atmosphere grew heavy with an unspoken realization, and a thick silence settled over the room, stretching on for several seconds that felt like an eternity. During this interval, attendees were grasped by a sense of anticipation, as if waiting for an unfolding moment of crucial importance. Then, suddenly, chaos erupted with an intensity that shook the very foundations of the assembly. Members of the Democratic faction sprang to their feet almost simultaneously, some vocalizing urgent demands for immediate responses from Johnson, the Speaker, while others called insistently for convening an emergency ethics committee meeting to scrutinize the unfolding situation more thoroughly. Meanwhile, the Republican side, exhibiting a clear split in leadership, saw their highest figures clustering tightly around Johnson, attempting to guide the rapid course of events. Several moderates, however, stood apart from the fray, their expressions troubled, their brows furrowed as they pored over the documents that Crockett, a legislator known for her detailed work, had distributed among colleagues. These documents appeared to carry significant implications, raising questions and doubts in the minds of many. In the midst of this turmoil, the presiding officer, maintaining a semblance of order amid the chaos, sharply struck the gavel several times in succession with firm authority. His voice rang out, demanding, "The House will be in order," a call that resonated through the chamber, attempting to restore composure and discipline. The repeated command gradually subdued the clamor, and silence was once again restored, allowing for a semblance of calm to settle over the assembly. It was at this moment that Majoritarian Leader Steve Scalise was recognized, and he quickly took the floor with a formal motion. He proposed, in a clear and deliberate manner, that the House should temporarily recess, stating that the session would hold until further notice at the call of the chair. However, before his motion could even be considered, the Democratic leader, Hakeem Jeffries, immediately arose to voice a challenge. With a firm stance, he objected to the proposed delay, insisting that the House deserved an instantaneous and thorough response to these extraordinary allegations that had just been laid out. He emphasized that the Speaker, as the presiding authority, needed to address the chamber directly, without delay, to clarify the situation. Amid this escalating tension, the parliamentarian hurriedly conferred with the chairperson, their faces etched with concern, both visibly overwhelmed by the procedural crisis unfolding before them. In the resulting confusion, Johnson itself shifted toward the floor of the chamber, making a noticeable movement as if to speak. All eyes quickly settled on him, the room's attention sharp and expectant, awaiting his words. Expressing appreciation for the opportunity to respond, Johnson commenced by stating, "I appreciate the opportunity to address these allegations," his voice steadying in tone despite the tense atmosphere, contrasting with the anxious expression he bore. He went on to assert that the accusations made by Representative Crockett were fundamentally flawed, describing them as a narrative built on selective and misleading evidence, as well as mischaracterized communications. Attempting to project confidence and authority, Johnson straightened his posture and continued, explaining that the modifications made to the final legislative text were merely technical corrections, necessary to implement the core principles of their bipartisan agreement, while also ensuring the provisions would be practical and enforceable once enacted. He emphasized that they had sought input from a variety of stakeholders, including experts from various industries who had practical experience with implementation. Johnson insisted that this consultative process was routine legislative procedure, demonstrating transparency and openness. Turning slightly toward the opposition side, he declared, "Nothing was hidden. Nothing was done in bad faith. If some members misunderstood the nature of certain provisions, I regret the confusion, but I can assure you there was no intention to deceive or manipulate." His attempt at a defensive explanation, meant to emphasize honesty and transparency, might have sufficed in more ordinary circumstances. However, at this critical juncture, Crockett, who remained at her station, unexpectedly raised a single sheet of paper toward the cameras, making sure her motion was visible to the viewers. It was the same text message she had displayed earlier, which contained details of the changes they had made, changes that, according to her, had been implemented covertly, with the hope that the opposition would not notice until after the legislation's passage. She also indicated that she would call the relevant parties after the vote to clarify further. Johnson's prepared explanation halted abruptly in the middle of his sentence, as if his words collided with a contradictory reality. His argument about transparency was now visibly undermined by the evidence presented in Crockett's message, forcing him into a difficult position where he struggled to reconcile his claims with the reality before him. The members of the chamber watched intently as Johnson appeared to wrestle internally with this conflicting information, his face flickering with signs of unease. Then, quite unexpectedly, an act of remarkable courage and decisiveness unfolded. Representative Don Bacon, a moderate and pragmatic Republican from Nebraska, rose to his feet and addressed the speaker with a measured but firm tone. Raising his hand for a point of personal privilege, widely understood as an assertion of an important matter that required immediate attention, Bacon spoke clearly. "Mr. Speaker," he said, "I ask for a point of personal privilege." His tone carried an unmistakable weight, signaling the seriousness of the issue he was about to raise. He continued, "As a member who has diligently worked on drafting this legislation in good faith, I must now inquire, are the documents presented to us by Representative Crockett authentic?" His voice held both professionalism and genuine concern. "Did you, Mr. Speaker, assure our bipartisan working group that no substantial changes would be made to the bill, especially those allowing industry lobbyists to rewrite enforcement provisions originating from within your own party?" The question struck like a thunderclap across the chamber, resonating with shock and prompting immediate attention from all parties involved. Every eye in the room turned back toward Johnson, whose response would have profound implications. His answer, in many ways, would determine not only his credibility as a leader, but also influence the entire course of the House's ongoing proceedings and the future direction of the legislative efforts currently underway. The tension in the chamber was palpable as everyone awaited the resolution of this pivotal moment, an inquiry that could either clear the air or ignite a deeper crisis within the body politic itself. The exchange of words and the tense atmosphere within the chamber finally reached a breaking point. Johnson, after a period of silence, managed to speak again, his voice noticeably quieter than before. However, these words were delivered without the full context of what had transpired. They were incomplete and lacked clarity. The content that came from him emphasized that the recent changes discussed had fallen squarely within his authority as the presiding officer, an assertion meant to justify the actions taken. His statement, however, sparked an immediate, palpable reaction among the members present. An audible gasp rippled through the legislative chamber, spreading from one side of the room to the other as the gravity of the moment sank in. It was apparent that his speech was not an outright admission of guilt, nor a full denial of the central allegations, but hovered somewhere in a delicate middle ground, leaving the question open and unresolved. Meanwhile, Bacon remained standing still, observing the scene with a composed but attentive demeanor. With respectful seriousness, he addressed the presiding officer directly, noting that the core issue at hand was not merely about who held the authority to make changes, but focused on the fundamental trust that underpins legislative work. He pointed out that the real concern was whether members could rely on their colleagues across the aisle to honor bipartisan agreements. Without that trust, the entire function of the legislative body could be compromised, jeopardizing effective governance. This critique underscored the deepening crisis. If trust eroded, legislative cooperation might become impossible, causing paralysis instead of progress. The unresolved tension in the air magnified as more Republicans, sensing the shifting dynamics and the rising unrest, subtly edged away from the leadership. The situation was escalating beyond a routine dispute. What had started as a brief 5-minute speech by a freshman Democrat ultimately evolved into a full-blown crisis of confidence in the speaker himself. It was as if the chamber had reached a breaking point. Recognizing the growing divide, Jeff, another member of the House, rose to his feet once more. Seizing the moment amid these extraordinary circumstances, he proposed a significant, bipartisan response, a motion to establish a special committee consisting of members from both parties, tasked with thoroughly investigating the allegations concerning the Border Security Act. He recommended that this committee should complete its inquiry and present its findings within a span of only 14 days, emphasizing the urgency and importance of transparency. Unexpectedly, Bacon took the floor next. Without hesitation, he voiced his support for the motion, seconding it formally and urging his Republican colleagues to do the same. In his words, if their shared values included transparency, honesty, and integrity, then there was no reason to oppose such a request. The establishment of a committee to uncover the full truth was not just a procedural matter, but a vital step toward restoring confidence and ensuring accountability. He believed that embracing this approach would demonstrate a commitment to good governance and respect for the legislative process. Meanwhile, Johnson continued to stand motionless at the podium, frozen as he watched his authority, something he had once wielded confidently, gradually disintegrate right before his eyes. The presiding officer, uncertain of how to navigate forward amid this unexpected upheaval, looked toward the parliamentarian for guidance. Both officials appeared unsettled, uncertain whether the usual procedures should be followed or if exceptional measures were necessary given the extraordinary circumstances. In the midst of this rare lapse in party discipline, Crockett, who until then had played a confrontational role, spoke again. Her tone had softened, becoming more measured and less aggressive. She emphasized that the matter at hand was not about political advantage or partisan scoring, but about the fundamental question of whether agreements reached across party lines genuinely meant anything anymore. She underscored that every single member in the chamber, regardless of their party affiliation, bore a stake in maintaining that trust and ensuring the integrity of the legislative process. Her words seemed to resonate deeply. A moment of collective realization appeared to settle over the chamber. Legislators from both sides nodded quietly, recognizing that something vital to the stability of their institution had been at risk. For a fleeting second, partisanship was set aside as they acknowledged that preserving trust and integrity transcended party lines. Leaders from both factions then huddled discreetly with the parliamentarian, attempting to find a way forward amid the chaos. Cell phone cameras and news crews captured these pivotal moments, revealing Johnson sitting alone at the leadership desk. His physical isolation symbolized the fragility of his position and the rapid erosion of support around him. The sense of a leader's confidence waning was almost tangible. Within minutes, clips from the exchange flooded social media platforms and news feeds, especially the controversial text message that had been exchanged, messages Johnson could not directly refute, but that cast serious doubt on his integrity and command. This incident, which began as a simple 5-minute speech on the House floor, had transformed into one of the most consequential confrontations in recent legislative history. It raised profound, often unspoken questions about the very core of the legislative process, its honesty, its adherence to norms, and the trust upon which it was built. The ripple effects of this confrontation spread swiftly across the political landscape. Within the first 60 minutes, the trending topics on social media included the receipts presented by Crockett and Johnson's apparent inability to disprove or dismiss them. News alerts flashed across Washington, interrupting regular programming with breaking reports on the developing scandal. Commentators and analysts described what had happened that day as more than just a political showdown. It was a stark reflection of a broader crisis, shaking the foundation of legislative integrity. As former House parliamentarian Charles Johnson explained on MSNBC, the evidence now circulating indicated that the Speaker had secretly altered bipartisan legislation after agreements had been signed, alterations that potentially violated established House norms and basic principles of trust necessary for Congress to operate effectively. Reporters hurried through hallways, seeking reactions from members and aides, while the partisan divide was evident but not absolute. Some politicians, despite their affiliations, expressed their surprise and concern openly. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for instance, did not conceal her astonishment at the unfolding events, highlighting the unprecedented nature of the crisis and underlining the importance of addressing it transparently. The entire episode demonstrated how, in moments of crisis, traditional partisan lines could blur, revealing the fragile yet vital hold that trust and integrity have within the legislative process. Today, the actions taken by Congresswoman Crockett were nothing short of extraordinary. Rather than simply leveling accusations or making vague claims, she presented tangible evidence, documents, records, and data that substantiated her assertions. This approach exemplifies what genuine accountability looks like in real time, holding those involved responsible through concrete proof rather than just words. Her willingness to come forward with verified documentation marked a notable moment of transparency, striving to illuminate the truth amid ongoing controversy. The reactions from Republican members of Congress to Crockett's revelations quickly exposed underlying internal tensions and divisions within the party. Supporters and loyalists sought to dismiss her evidence, claiming that it was selectively chosen or taken out of context to suit her narrative. They argued that the materials did not provide a fair or complete picture, thus attempting to undermine her credibility by casting doubt on the authenticity or relevance of her documents. Meanwhile, more moderate voices within the party began to voice cautious concern, recognizing that the situation warranted careful consideration and that dismissing the evidence outright might be short-sighted or damaging in the long run. One congressional representative, Bacon, elaborated on this tension during conversations with reporters, emphasizing the gravity of the allegations if proven true. He pointed out that what Crockett had presented, if verified, indicated a profound breach of the trust that underpins the legislative process. Such a breach would be a matter of concern, not just from a partisan standpoint, but as an issue that strikes at the core integrity of government institutions. This kind of critique transcends party lines because it addresses the fundamental responsibility lawmakers have to operate transparently and honestly. As the day progressed, the fallout from these revelations intensified. An emergency Republican conference was convened to discuss the controversy, and the atmosphere was palpable with tension. Following this, Senator Johnson issued a statement carefully crafted to address the issue. While he acknowledged that he took concerns regarding transparency seriously, his wording sought to maintain some ambiguity. He noted that communication with stakeholders, such as constituents, lobbyists, and government agencies, was a normal and expected part of the legislative process. At the same time, he expressed regret if there was any impression that changes to the Border Security Act had been made secretly or in bad faith, indicating an awareness of the sensitive political context. Johnson's statement made no outright denial of Crockett's allegations. Instead, it appeared to sidestep direct refutation, which only served to deepen public and media scrutiny. On Fox News, which, despite its conservative leanings, often scrutinizes Republican figures, hosts pressed Republican guests with pointed questions about whether the party leader or speaker had indeed betrayed trust, regardless of political orientation. One conservative commentator, Guy Benson, remarked that, "When you tell members one thing and communicate a different message to industry representatives through texts, that's a serious credibility problem." His comments highlighted how inconsistencies in communications could undermine trust across all levels of government and within the party itself. The immediate impact of these events was reflected in polling data. The very next day, surveys revealed a sharp decline in Johnson's approval ratings, dropping by approximately 14 points in just the first poll conducted after the confrontation. Particularly alarming for Republican leadership was the data showing significant concern among independents, about 62% of whom found Crockett's evidence to be concerning or very concerning, and among Republicans themselves, with 41% sharing those concerns. These figures signaled growing unease among key voter groups about the integrity of the leadership and the legislative process. Seizing the moment of vulnerability and recognizing the importance of institutional accountability, Democratic leaders swiftly announced their intention to push for a floor vote. Their goal was to establish a special bipartisan committee tasked explicitly with investigating the allegations related to the Border Security Act. They warned that if Republican representatives failed to voluntarily agree to create such a committee, they would push for a formal vote to do so, ensuring an independent and thorough inquiry. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, some moderate Republicans appeared to be privately debating whether President Johnson's leadership and current stance could be sustained. These internal discussions reflected growing doubts about the viability of his position. as party members struggled with the implications of the allegations and the broader questions about transparency and accountability. For Crockett, however, this controversy significantly elevated her national profile. Her calm, fact-based approach to presenting evidence was widely praised, not only by supporters but also by some unexpected critics. Regardless of how one might perceive her political views, conservative columnist Jonah Goldberg commended her actions, stating that Crockett demonstrated what proper oversight should look like, focused on concrete documentation rather than vague insinuations or innuendos. Her insistence on specific, verifiable documents seemed to resonate as a model of accountability, elevating her role from a mere participant to a key figure in this high-stakes congressional inquiry. A few days later, the situation reached a crescendo when Washington was stunned by the unanimous decision of 23 moderate Republicans to join forces with Democrats. Together, they passed a motion to create a bipartisan, specially appointed committee tasked explicitly with investigating the allegations surrounding the Border Security Act. The vote was a striking rebuke to Johnson's leadership, signaling a significant shift in congressional dynamics and emphasizing the importance of thorough oversight over partisan loyalty. This development was not just symbolic, it carried meaningful implications. The new committee's formation served as a validation of Crockett's method of evidence presentation and a repudiation of any efforts to dismiss or downplay her findings. In addition, it introduced a more balanced and credible investigative structure. As part of this restructuring, three well-respected Republicans, Don Bacon, Brian Fitzpatrick, and Nancy Mace, issued a joint statement stressing the importance of maintaining the integrity of the legislative process beyond party interests. They emphasized that when serious questions emerge about whether bipartisan agreements have been honored, all members of Congress bear the responsibility to seek and uncover the truth diligently. The makeup of the newly formed committee reflected the gravity of the moment. It was composed of equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans, symbolizing a spirit of bipartisan cooperation. The chairmanship was assigned to moderate Republican Mike Turner, whose reputation for fairness was recognized by all parties, while Jasmine Crockett was named vice chair in acknowledgement of her central role in uncovering and exposing the controversy. This appointment also signified her rising stature within Congress and her recognition as a key figure committed to transparency and accountability in legislative affairs. The political landscape faced a turbulent upheaval as the fallout from recent events continued to intensify, casting a long shadow over the reputation and stability of the legislative body. For Representative Crockett, the crisis was not merely a fleeting controversy, but a relentless series of blows that seemed to accumulate with each passing day, steadily eroding the trust and confidence once placed in the political institutions and their leaders. The situation escalated further when, only a week after Crockett's revelations, the Washington Examiner, a prominent conservative news outlet closely aligned with the Republican viewpoint, published a fresh batch of documents that served to reinforce Crockett's claims with even more tangible evidence. These newly surfaced documents included private communications, texts exchanged between Johnson's staff members and high-ranking representatives of various industry groups, conversations that revealed discussions aimed at circumventing stringent enforcement provisions embedded within the legislation. These exchanges highlighted clandestine efforts to devise strategies that would allow certain provisions to be implemented or bypassed without provoking the suspicion or anger of Democratic supporters and voters. As the mounting evidence became increasingly difficult to dismiss, the pressure on Johnson's leadership intensified, compelling him to address his colleagues in a strictly confidential setting. An emergency meeting convened specifically for the Republican caucus. According to reports from multiple attendees present at that gathering, Johnson's tone and admissions appeared markedly different from his public statements. He openly acknowledged that he had made mistakes in the manner in which the final bill was handled, admitting that his belief in the necessity of some of the last-minute changes had blinded him to the importance of transparency with fellow members involved in drafting and passing the legislation. He expressed remorse for not being more straightforward with the legislative team and others who had contributed to the process, recognizing that the lack of openness had further damaged his credibility. Despite these candid admissions, the public uprising among his colleagues showed no sign of abatement. The so-called Emi Alpa, a term used to denote the failed attempt to quell the growing unrest, did little to stem the tide of discontent that was now rippling through the Republican ranks. A mere fortnight after Crockett's brief but impactful announcement, a significant milestone was reached when Representative Ken Buck from Colorado became the first member of the opposition party, an influential Republican, to publicly call for Johnson's resignation as Speaker of the House. His statement was clear and unambiguous. Once the trust between a leader and his colleagues is irreparably broken, there is little hope of restoring it. Buck emphasized that, in the interest of maintaining the integrity of the institution, Johnson's best course of action would be to step down from his leadership role. This call to resignation was only the beginning. Within just a few days, additional Republicans echoed similar sentiments publicly, and reports suggested that many others were now carefully contemplating their own positions, weighing whether continued support for Johnson was tenable or if they should seek alternative leadership. The congressional investigation that followed was marked by a level of seriousness and urgency rarely seen in similar probes. Unlike many investigations that tend to devolve into partisan circus acts filled with political posturing and grandstanding, this one aimed to cut through the rhetoric and focus resolutely on the facts. Born from a breach of bipartisan confidence, the inquiry maintained a tight, disciplined focus on uncovering the truth. Over a span of 2 weeks, the committee diligently collected documents, held interviews, and analyzed the evidence before ultimately releasing preliminary findings that confirmed Crockett's core accusations. It was established beyond any doubt that Johnson, after reaching an agreement with bipartisan support, authorized substantial modifications to enforcement provisions, alterations that closely resembled language supplied by industry lobbyists eager to influence the outcome. More significantly, steps had been taken to keep these modifications hidden from Democratic supporters and the wider public until the legislation had already been passed, thus preventing any reservations or objections from derailing the process. The evidence presented in the preliminary report was unequivocal. It highlighted that the commitments made during the bipartisan negotiations, intended to ensure transparency and fairness, had been ultimately ignored in the final version of the bill. Instead, the changes were implemented in a deliberately secretive manner, designed to avoid detection until after the legislation had been adopted. The report was signed by all members of the committee, including Republicans, signaling a rare moment of bipartisan consensus amid ongoing turmoil. This revelation dealt a devastating blow not only to Johnson's credibility, but also to what remained of his authority and influence within the House. The political fallout was swift and dramatic. Within hours, Tom Emmer, the party whip, called for an urgent meeting of the Republican leadership to debate possible responses and chart a way forward amidst the growing crisis. In an outcome that many political observers would have found hard to imagine just weeks earlier, 3 days later, Mike Johnson, a relatively new figure in Congress, made the startling announcement that he would be stepping down from his role as Speaker of the House. He clarified that he intended to remain in Congress, but believed that his departure from the leadership position was the best course of action to allow the legislative body to move beyond the tumult and distraction caused by recent events. Johnson stated, "I believe it is best for me to step aside from leadership at this time, acknowledging the immense challenges facing the institution and the importance of restoring stability." His resignation was a stark and powerful validation of Crockett's brief but impactful presentation, an event that, in a sense, became a turning point because an inexperienced freshman legislator had effectively ended a well-established speaker's tenure through carefully prepared and irrefutable evidence. This episode served as a catalyst for a broader and more profound reckoning within Congress about what mechanisms and safeguards should be in place to prevent such breaches of trust from occurring in the future. The incident also prompted intense scrutiny and reflection from media outlets renowned for their political analysis, ranging from the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal to the columns of the Washington Post. These analyses questioned how the legislative process had become so distorted and compromised that deception and secret negotiations could take root and flourish undetected until it was too late. The confrontation between Crockett and Johnson, then, did not just expose individual misconduct. It revealed a deeper, systemic crisis engulfing the very core of legislative integrity, a crisis articulated by prominent congressional scholar Norman Ornstein, who pointed out that the flaws highlighted by this incident represent a troubling symptom of an institution struggling to uphold its fundamental principles of transparency, accountability, and bipartisanship. When even agreements that are explicitly bipartisan, meaning those crafted collectively by members of both major political parties, are secretly compromised or subtly undermined during the often convoluted process of negotiation and finalization, it becomes clear that the very foundation of trust necessary for effective legislation begins to erode. In such an environment, the ability to rely on the integrity of the legislative process diminishes drastically, making genuine cooperation and transparent policymaking exceedingly difficult to sustain. For Crockett, this realization brought about a profound and transformative change in her approach and her role within the political landscape. Her journey from a promising newcomer, full of ambition and fresh perspectives, to a nationally recognized figure dedicated to holding government accountable was nothing short of remarkable. She vividly recalled, about a month after her initial emergence onto the national scene, that she had not started her congressional career seeking out confrontation or controversy. Instead, her primary motivation was to serve her constituents and improve the legislative process. However, her commitment was immediately tested when she uncovered compelling evidence indicating that the integrity of the legislative process had been seriously compromised. Faced with a moral imperative to respond, she recognized that to remain silent or passive would be to betray her duty, regardless of the political costs her stance might entail. This unwavering stance and her method of exposing wrongdoing soon became a model that garnered attention and respect from political observers and practitioners alike on both sides of the aisle. Some began to refer to her approach as the Crockett method, an approach distinguished by its emphasis on meticulous investigation, the diligent presentation of concrete documents, and a framing that prioritized protecting the core institutional integrity of Congress over partisan point scoring or political expediency. What rendered her presentation so powerfully impactful was not solely the evidence she conveyed, which Politico highlighted as notably compelling, but also the way she articulated her case. Her framing framed the issue as a fundamental defense of the legislative process itself, an effort to uphold the essential principles of fairness, transparency, and honesty, rather than simply attacking or defending particular political figures or parties. Her words and actions struck a chord because they allowed policymakers and the public to see that it was possible to pursue an investigation or reform without alienating one's political allies or betraying partisan loyalties. This was especially significant at a time when political polarization often made such efforts difficult or deemed risky. Within just 6 months, the impact of Crockett's principled stand and her powerful 5-minute presentation continued to reverberate in the corridors of Congress. A new speaker had been installed, and there were noticeable changes, newly strengthened rules governing the approval of final legislative texts, as well as increased scrutiny and verification procedures before the official release of bill language. Both political parties, recognizing the importance of reform, began to promote a culture of greater transparency and accountability. Sometimes, as history has repeatedly shown, fleeting moments, mere minutes, can have a profound effect on the course of political events. As The Atlantic's retrospective analysis later observed, Crockett's confrontation with Johnson was remembered not just for its immediate effects on legislation or proceedings, but also for its broader symbolic significance. It served as a brief but illuminating reminder of a fundamental truth about democratic governance: that amid the intense divisions and conflicts that characterize contemporary politics, a shared commitment to honesty and integrity in procedural processes remains the bedrock upon which the legitimacy of our political system depends. This story, and the lessons it imparts, continued to shape the evolution of American politics well beyond that single episode. Over time, The familiar refrain of staying informed and vigilant persisted, emphasizing the importance of ongoing scrutiny and active engagement. The narrative reinforced the need to pay close attention to developments within Congress, to understand how power is exercised, and to recognize moments of courage where individuals step forward to hold that power accountable. It underscored a core principle that in a healthy democracy, even in an era of fierce partisan rivalry, there exists a foundational commitment to honesty, transparency, and integrity that must be maintained if the system is to function properly. In the wake of these events, the ongoing story of congressional accountability continues to unfold, driven by efforts to reinforce transparency and responsibility. The familiar call to stay abreast of the latest legislative developments and political analysis remains as relevant as ever, reminding citizens and observers alike of the importance of an informed public. It encourages active participation, whether through careful watching or active engagement, to ensure that the momentum initiated by individuals like Crockett endures and expands. Such support and awareness are vital because they enable the media and watchdog organizations to provide in-depth coverage of the true operation of power within Washington, highlighting both moments of courage and instances where that power might be misused or concealed. Ultimately, these stories serve as a testament to the idea that, even in the most polarized environments, honest individuals committed to the principles of democratic governance can effect change by holding those in authority to the highest standards of integrity and reminding everyone that the health of a democracy depends fundamentally on the collective commitment to truth and transparency.